I'm very pleased to welcome you to this session on the financing aspects of the humanitarian crisis that we are facing globally at this time. My name is Colin Bruce, and I have the privilege of moderating this session. We are fortunate to have a panel that will bring perspectives from donors, perspectives from agencies, implementing agencies on the humanitarian side, but also on the development side. And perhaps most importantly, we are also fortunate to have on our panel someone who has been on the receiving end of both the root causes of some of the humanitarian crises and who himself has been a refugee at some point in his life. I hope he wouldn't mind talking a little bit from that perspective as well. And the reason for pulling this type of panel together is that we want to get below the surface of these issues and try to understand them in a more profound and hopefully a more impactful way from our different perspectives. And so without much ado, I want to introduce Ian Walliser, our Vice President for Equitable Growth, Finance and Institutions here within the World Bank Group, who will offer some remarks to help frame the conversation. And then we will get more deeply into the subject from the perspectives of our panelists. Now, Jan has mentioned that he has another appointment, so if you see him step out, it's not because of lack of interest, it's simply that he's very much in demand. So let's turn to him right now, and then we'll continue with the rest of the panel discussion.
Well, thank you very, very much, Colin, and I will add my words of welcome to you all, and also to the Honourable Minister, with whom I had the pleasure, of course, of working in my previous position in the Africa region. So I think it's a great pleasure to have this distinguished panel here that will discuss the issue of financing, of the future of humanitarian financing. I think in the end we know that a lot of talk has to be followed by the financial aspects for us to actually make progress on the agendas that we are trying to set in this space of the fragile and conflict-affected states. So the challenge that we're facing, of course, today is ever more intense. I think we're all following intensely the crisis in the Middle East, but I think I just want to remind everybody this. Colin will appreciate that remark about seeing, for example, the Central African Republic coming out of an electoral cycle and now facing the issue of how are we in exactly the space between humanitarian issues and the issue of development going to make progress in a country that has been ravaged by 2 years of internal strife and is among one of the states that often are forgotten in the international sphere as they both in times of crisis, but also as they emerge from crisis, the risk is even higher that people may not pay attention to the needs of these smaller countries out of conflict and affected by violence. We think that by 2030, 60% of the world's poor could be expected to be living in fragile situations, an increase of about 20 percentage points over where we are today, where 43% of the world's poor are in fragile countries. And clearly we can therefore not achieve the Sustainable Development Goals as well as the World Bank's twin goals of ending poverty and boosting shared prosperity without addressing these drivers of risk and vulnerability. And against this backdrop, it is that the international community is preparing for the World Humanitarian Summit this May in Istanbul. This conversation here will be important to exchange and inform that process and shape a new vision for humanitarian action. In advance of that summit, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, has challenged us to set aside institutional labels of development or humanitarian organizations and to work together with the Sustainable Development Goals as our common framework. And he has challenged us to reinforce and not replace local systems and actors, to anticipate and not wait for crisis, and to overcome the humanitarian or development divide by working toward collective and long-term outcomes based on comparative advantage of the respective institutions working in this space. To fulfill our goals, We will also need to tap new sources of finance, and that's the topic of the session today, to deliver these resources more effectively. And we will need to access capital from the markets to create incentives for private sector to get involved and to develop financial solutions and decision-making processes that improve the mobilization, allocation, and delivery of resources. I believe we can start working across 4 areas: expanding the capacity of international financial institutions, leveraging the capital and expertise of the private sector, working to crowd in other actors, and collectively focus on prevention and preparedness. Let me focus in turn on each of these 4 areas. At the World Bank Group, we're expanding our financial capacity to meet the needs of low and middle income countries. We're building on a menu of financial solutions across our 4 operational units, the IBRD, IDA, IFC, and MIGA. For example, in order to deliver lending to middle income countries at lower interest rates than market interest rates that we normally offer for middle income countries, we are developing arrangements where a grant and a loan are blended together. Along with the United Nations and the Islamic Development Bank, we're developing a facility that will support countries in the Middle East and North Africa that confront vast numbers of refugees and internally displaced people. This facility would involve a new way of using grants from donor countries by blending them with lending from multilateral development banks. Tapping into the capital markets can also help expand our financing capacity. We're aiming to issue special bonds that will be guaranteed by donors. This will create additional space on the balance sheets of MDBs for recovery and reconstruction plans. Second, leveraging the capital and expertise of the private sector. In addition to expanding public capacity, we need to do a better job of leveraging the private sector with its multiplier effect. In the response to the Ebola crisis, for example, we worked with financial services and telecom companies to develop a mobile payment system that let emergency and health workers receive their wages directly on cell phones, even in many of the remote areas. This was particularly effective in Sierra Leone, where most people have a mobile phone, but many people don't have bank accounts. Attracting private sector investment requires building skills and infrastructure. Moreover, it requires an understanding of the incentives that shape market decisions. It also means building a stronger financial sector by investing in more efficient and more inclusive financial systems. Where the investment climate is poor and where risks are high, guarantee instruments can help investors manage political and credit risks. In the West Bank and Gaza, for example, MIGA provides political risk insurance to small and medium-sized enterprises in the agribusiness and manufacturing sectors. Another way of sharing customized insurance instruments and risk pools, of risk sharing through customized insurance instrument and risk pools, which have already been used to deal with the disaster risks, is an area in which we have worked. The Pandemic Emergency Facility is a partnership between the Bank Group and the World Health Organization on which we are currently working. As a global risk pool, it will disperse funds based on pre-agreed triggers linked to early warning systems for diseases. Using public funding in this way will help save lives and livelihoods by acting early. Third, working to crowd in other actors. Today's humanitarian challenge requires expanding our reach and crowding in other actors. In its report to the UN Secretary General, the high-level panel on humanitarian financing identified several new ideas, including reaching out to non-traditional donors and supporting more crowdfunding. It also emphasizes facilitating the flow of remittances. While transaction costs are decreasing, they are still too high, averaging almost 8% globally. Reducing such costs could generate huge benefits worldwide. Another source of funding is Islamic social financing. A number of Islamic financial institutions are looking into how WAF, zakat, and other instruments such as sukuk bonds can help meet humanitarian needs. And finally, collectively investing in prevention and preparedness. We have many options for improving access to financing, for allocating funding in different ways, and for improving delivery. At the same time, we must reduce need, which requires investing in prevention and preparedness. As the Secretary General of the United Nations has reminded us, ahead of the World Humanitarian Summit, we need to anticipate and not wait for crisis to happen. Whether it is investing in safer infrastructure in disaster-prone countries or supporting social cohesion and inclusion in fragile contexts, the magnitude of the needs makes it crucial to address the causes of crisis early on and head-on. To conclude, we have learned a great deal about delivering financial resources and technical assistance to countries in crisis in the last decade. But we now see various risks dangerously converging. Taken together, natural disasters, climate change, food insecurity, epidemics, and other shocks can exacerbate fragility. Mitigating and managing these converging risks will require us to do more to address the underlying causes of fragility and vulnerability, seeking new ways to balance the urgent priorities in crisis situations with a longer-term need for continuing commitment and predictable financing. I'd already in advance like to thank our panelists for their insights in the upcoming discussion, which will surely help us to creatively think about the next steps in this important debate on humanitarian financing and development financing and the space in which they come together. Thank you so very much, and I wish you interesting deliberations and discussions.
Thank you very much, Jan. So Jan has spoken about what we in the World Bank are doing in terms of looking at our instruments, being creative, reaching out to others, and crowding in additional resources, including from the private sector, and working specifically in certain areas, for example, Islamic finance. We're going to talk a little bit about that during this session. But I want to perhaps start off the panel discussion portion of this by perhaps hearing first from a donor, because I think for many of us, right now, if we look at the data, much of humanitarian financing comes from donors. And so I'm going to turn to David Kennedy, who is the Director General of DFID, responsible for economic development, to share with us his perspective as not just a donor, but a major donor, and one that's extraordinarily active in this ongoing conversation about how we grapple with and resolve the challenges of humanitarian financing. So over to you, sir.
What? Okay, am I on there? Right. Thank you, Chairman. I think we should start by saying that we've got a poverty reduction mandate, as has the World Bank, and that really quickly takes you into dealing with stability and the humanitarian space. So I think you can't seriously, in the world that we live in, be tackling poverty if you're not in that space of dealing with instability and trying to get through those crises into a more stable situation. So that is central to what we're doing. That is a commitment that we've made in our new ODA strategy. So several months ago, the UK did publish an ODA strategy, and you'll see there various elements that increase this stability focus. So for example, we will spend a lot more in the MENA countries, £700 million every year. We will establish a crisis reserve of £3.5 billion, and we will spend over 50% of our money in fragile states. I think it raises a question then of what is our approach and how are we thinking about promoting stability. And the way we're seeing this is not in the traditional humanitarian way, so you do need to respond to crisis with these near-term response saving lives, but we want to think about a continuum. And that continuum starts with how do you address the causes of instability, so inclusive economic growth, inclusive political processes, through to well, how can you prepare in advance for crises, which is about the resilience. You know, one of the things we are increasingly focused on is insurance products. So you may have heard of the Africa Risk Capacity, where governments can insure their populations against natural disaster. That is a growth area for us. So what can you do in the resilience space? There is then the crisis response when the crisis happens, but I think again increasingly what we're focused on is the protracted crisis, and how do you move to a situation of sustainable mechanisms for financing provision of basic services, and how do you provide economic opportunities for displaced populations, for example. So the recent Syria conference, was very much about how do we get economic opportunities for the Syrian refugees in Jordan, for example, where we hope that we can grow export-based manufacturing. We've looked at trade preferences and finance for that. So, that is our approach. I think there is a question of the finance as well. Now, clearly, we need more finance in this space. There is a huge demand, and we need more. I've said that we've committed more as DFID. I think if other countries were to step up and make good on the 0.7 commitment, as we have done, that would provide additional money, a small chunk of which would help to address the financing gap that we've got in this space. I think it's really important to say, though, as well, it's not all about more finance. It's about different kinds of finances, as Jan has said. So that join up with the broader development finance, I think the join up hasn't been there in the way it could be. And I think that is a focus for the Humanitarian Summit as we go forward. How can we link up the humanitarian and the development on that continuum of preempting crisis, strengthening resilience, and then dealing with protracted crisis? Innovative finance is also part of it. So it's not just about the traditional financing mechanisms. I've talked about insurance from us. I think Jan mentioned what can we do with remittances, what can we do with Islamic finance. We've got a colleague here with experience in social impact bonds. I'm interested to hear if we can do anything in that space, development impact bonds as well. I think I should finish by saying I'm here to talk with my bank counterparts on the forward look for the bank. So this is the broad stepping back and saying, what should the bank look like in the future? How can it evolve to remain relevant in the changing world that we face? And two of the big asks for the UK in the context of the forward look are to do more and better on fragile states, and to do the same with protracted crises. And this isn't just about IDA, it's also going beyond IDA to middle-income countries, for example, like Jordan, who need concessional finance to deal with the fallout of Syria. So the focus again should be the prevention and the long-term response, in addition to that traditional humanitarian response. So we do have a great opportunity, I think, as the bank does its forward look, as we come into the Humanitarian Summit, to get that broader development humanitarian join up to improve the system, to get better coordination and collective action. And I hope over the next months that is what we do. We take that opportunity and we get that holistic, more joined up approach.
Thank you. Let me stay on that side, if you like, of the panel. While we focus on more, then we're going to talk a little bit more about how, when, and for what. Okay? So it's not all about money. Money is important. So let's get that out of the way by talking about all the innovations about getting more. But then we want to spend a substantial amount of our time talking about how this money is actually used, and why that is so extraordinarily important when we come to the issue of financing. So let me turn next to Mr. Amir Rahman, talking again about innovations to increase the pie, as opposed to just how the pie is used. He's the managing director of the Fahir Capital Group, and he will tell us a little bit more about some of the innovations that he's been supporting around Islamic finance.
Thank you very much, Chairman. And indeed, there have already been a couple of references to Islamic social finance, which I will touch on, and also as a private equity investor. So Fajr Capital's primary business is that we invest private equity investments in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. But in particular, I'd like to speak about Islamic social finance, since that's an important topic for us. As was referred to, the high-level panel for humanitarian financing in the UN has published a report, which I have a copy of here and which is available to you all through the internet, in which Islamic social finance was recognized as one of the opportunities for additional funding. And I believe that was a very appropriate recognition for a number of reasons. So one is that indeed, A great bulk of the current humanitarian crises are happening in Muslim-majority countries. According to the report, 90% of humanitarian crises are happening in Muslim-majority environments. And because of that, it is entirely appropriate that the solutions for funding should also come from or be related to the Islamic world and indeed be rooted in the Islamic tradition, of which I'm happy to say there are many such solutions that can be brought to bear. What I'd like to share with you very briefly is the array of Islamic social finance. So when we say Islamic social finance, what in particular do we mean by way of financing mechanisms? And by social finance, I mean finance that's done without any return or private gain to the contributor. So this is not for-profit investing, but this is done for social benefit solely. So there are three basic types to be aware of. The first is general charity, which in Arabic we call sadaqah. And sadaqah is extremely broad, and it can be for nearly any purpose, in nearly any amount, at nearly any time. So it's a very, very broad form of giving that covers just about anything you can think of. A second form is zakah, and the report particularly talks about zakah, which is spelled Z-A-K-A-H. And this is one of what's called the 5 pillars of Islam. It's essential part of the Islamic faith, and it is a mandatory almsgiving, a mandatory charity of 2.5% of an individual's wealth on an annual basis. So it's not of income, but of wealth, accumulated wealth. And zakah has certain categories in which it can be used, and those do cover the vast majority of humanitarian situations, including the poor, the needy, the displaced. So those are all within the categories of zakah. But there are specific conditions, such as, for example, zakah needs to be dispersed within 1 year. So when you give your zakah, it has to be dispersed and reach the recipient before the next year comes. And in our discussions with the United Nations and other agencies, this can sometimes be a challenge. Similarly, there's a cap on overhead of 1/8 of the sum that's given. So these can create some challenges in terms of implementation, but certainly it's worth looking at because the size of the zakah pool alone is estimated to be between 250 and 500 billion dollars on an annual basis. And the reason why that's such a staggeringly large sum, again, 250 to 500 billion, is remember, this is given on accumulated wealth, not only on income. So it's actually a very, very large sum. Now, a point I'd like to make then, so the third category is what we call awqaf, or endowments, Islamic endowments. And endowments are a very interesting combination because, of course, on the one hand, they're very flexible because endowments can be created for any charitable purpose. And once they are created, they're very much limited to the charter of the endowment. So, for example, an endowment can be created for displaced people. And if it's created for displaced people, then it cannot be used for another good cause. It can be created for orphans, but if it's created for orphans, it can't be used for another cause. So that's another tool available. And there's a great wealth of Islamic endowments, traditionally in real estate, but that sector is evolving very quickly to liquid forms of financial endowments, which again are a very large opportunity. Chairman, in closing on this, in terms of why this is so important, I'd like to refer to another report, it's called the Arab Giving Survey, and this was done by a journal called Philanthropy Age, and it was done in conjunction with YouGov. And I'll ask the audience actually as a poll. So one of the questions was, to what degree do your religious beliefs influence or shape your charitable giving? And it was a 1 to 10 scale. So the question I'll ask you is, what percentage do you think said 10 out of 10 on this survey? Would anyone venture a guess? Sorry? 8% was a guess. Any other guesses?
20.
20, says David. It was actually 45. And 5 said 9. So you take them together, 51% said 9 or 10 out of 10. So this is profoundly important. And as I mentioned before, the mechanisms are not in place necessarily for agencies like the UNHCR or UNICEF to accept this charity based on the conditions and requirements of Islamic social finance. So with that, Chairman, I'll just contrast it very quickly by saying that in the same survey, it talks about what prompts giving in the Arab world, which to some degree may be representative of the Islamic world as a whole, and 60% of that is driven by religious occasions, as compared to 32% by humanitarian crises. So people give more based on the religious occasion, be it Ramadan or another time of year, as opposed to when the need arises. So again, that's an important reason for tapping into this. So I'll just end my comments there with regards to Islamic social finance. And on the private investment side, all I'll say about that is that we need to find business models that are able to access fragile states and economies that have humanitarian crises. The investment capabilities are there, and we're happy to see within the Muslim majority world a great deal of interest in investing in these markets. And we are developing business models by which there's a combination of grants and financing, very similar to what was highlighted before by Jan, such that we can achieve private returns while also partnering with grant-making bodies.
Thank you very much. So a big takeaway from that, one is the potential to increase the pie, but also the need for platforms that are able to absorb those funds in a way that's consistent with the spirit and the philosophy behind giving. And I think that's something that we are working on with you, as you said, and we have yet more work to do in that area. Just one more intervention now about increasing the pie, growing the pie. Then we're going to get into some other more profound aspects of this. And to do that, I want to turn to Louise Savelle, who is Director of Social Finance. She is a pioneer in this area. Many of us have heard about social impact bonds, and if you're like me, somehow they stir something about my conscience when I hear social impact. I feel I need to be at least informed and perhaps even do something about it as a private citizen. So let's see if she can convince us that we should follow in her footsteps and look more closely at social impact bonds. Over to you.
No pressure. Thank you very much for asking me to speak at the panel this morning. So I jointly lead the International Development Focus team at our offices in London. And Social Finance developed the first impact bond back in 2010. The focus was in the UK. The focus was reducing recidivism, but it stirred a huge amount of interest. And just to give you a flavour, it's a young market, but today more than 50 have been launched worldwide. There are at least that number, again, under development. So this is a contracting form, I guess, that is gaining a huge amount of momentum and gaining a huge amount of excitement in its ability to attract private capital to social issues. In its simplest form, an impact bond is a payment by results contract, where investors take the risk on outcomes being delivered. And that means that a much greater percentage of contracts can be paid on an outcomes basis than has previously been possible under most other payment by results structures. Now, we think that has really important benefits in terms of enabling service provider flexibility and adaptation to really respond to local contexts and changing local contexts on the ground. As I said, it's still a young market. Investor demand somewhat is likely to depend on the issue and the geography. Many of the contracts issued to date have been, I think, seen by funders as slightly experimental, so have tended to be fairly small in size. Having said that, we've been having a number of conversations in recent months with large development finance institutions who are very interested in seeing scale deals come to the market and participating in those as investors. So it's a market that's likely to grow very quickly, we think. And certainly for the impact bonds that we've been involved in, almost all of them have been oversubscribed. So our sense is investment is not the issue here. There is money that wants to be put to work to achieve a blended return. In terms of thinking about how this approach might be applied to situations of humanitarian crisis, we think this model could have real applicability to, for instance, refugee communities. In the UK, some of our team are currently working to think about the use of impact bonds to support the integration and support of refugees and asylum seekers once they've been granted the right to remain. Support to access employment, benefits, housing, where previously that support wouldn't have been in place. Internationally, we think there may be really exciting potential to apply the model to populations living in refugee camps or moving out of refugee camps. It could be used building on a model that we've been developing in the West Bank to, for instance, more closely link vocational training to employer needs, to improve the employment rates of refugees as they settle into communities. Similarly, it could be used to ensure education access and learning outcomes among children and young people from those communities. So one of the advantages, I think, of attracting private capital to sit behind these results-based contracts is the management approach and the rigour that it creates. In the private sector, real-time programme adaptation, flexibility, change is seen as a sign of success, not, as so often in the development community, a sign of a planning failure. And I think that's particularly important in situations of fragility. In terms of making it work, in terms of making these structures work, I think we've found it to be extremely important to be very clear about what social issue you're trying to address and for whom. We found it very important to have a compelling vision for how those outcomes might be improved, accepting that will then be monitored and changed as the programme is implemented. And we've also found it, and I think this again is particularly important for situations of fragility, to be really important to think about what contractual risk is being transferred to investors. It's one thing to ask investors to take, if you like, implementation risk, the risk that the programme is delivered well and is meeting the needs of the population that it's being asked to serve. It may not be so appropriate to ask them to take geopolitical risk or policy risk. Actually, those risks may be better retained by the commissioning agency, the donors or governments that are working in that context. So we think this structure is exciting. We think it creates rational revenue streams where funding is channeled towards providers who are best able to deliver the social impact that people are wanting to see. It ensures contracting mechanisms allow for this local adaptation and flexibility to deliver success. And we very much hope that I've achieved what you've asked me to achieve and at least inspired a few of you to think about it as a mechanism.
Thank you very much, Louise. In fact, you provided one of the most straightforward definitions I've heard of what a social impact bond is, which is results-based contracting, maybe one takeaway for those of you looking for new insights. So what we've done so far in this session is to talk about how we increase the pie. How do we get more money into this space? And it's important because depending on whose numbers you believe, the shortfall could be as much as $15 billion a year. And if we're talking about saving lives, and if we're talking about basic needs that people have, and as a common humanity, it's something of concern to us. So we want to make sure there is enough money on the table. But I would like to put to you that just as important as the amount of money are several other considerations, including when the money comes, what it's used for or can be used for, who it comes from, and of course, in what form it's made available. And there's no one more qualified to speak to that issue, and I want to give him ample time to elaborate on this, than our Honorable Minister Amara Kune, Minister of Finance of Liberia. He has been helping Liberia through many crises, including the Ebola crisis that we hope is behind us, but every now and again it reminds us of its presence. He also is rather unique in that he himself became a refugee in Guinea at the age of 18. And out of that, and out of the volunteer leadership he provided, he was able to make an initial career with the International Rescue Committee and other organizations. So, sir, if I may turn the floor over to you to talk to us about some of these equally profound, if not more profound aspects from your perspective as a minister grappling to use these funds to make sure they're delivered in time, that you have the flexibility to allocate them as you see appropriate, and ultimately to make a difference in the development path of Liberia.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you very much. I will try to focus my intervention this afternoon to the most recent humanitarian crisis. But this time last year, in this very room, world leaders were here, with all of us, trying to deal with the Ebola crisis. And so it's still fresh on our minds, so we'll try to share some experience from there. But to begin with, to thank all of you for the support you provided to our countries, the 3 countries in the Mano River Union during that time. Look, it's important for us to, first of all, let me start, since we're talking about financing. Let me make reference to 2 critical pieces of facilities that made a big difference in all 3 countries. First was the World Bank Crisis Response Window. That window was used, to channel funds to our countries after President Jim Kim, announced the resources that the bank was going to put behind the Ebola fight. And then, in order to prevent our economies from collapsing, so in the case of Liberia, you go from 6% projected growth. Everything is well, you think you're about to meet your target, and then you fall to 0.3, all overnight, So your ability to run the government, to provide services, to meet your payroll and all of that is at risk. So the IMF has what you call the Rapid Credit Facility. You need that to support your balance of payment issues. So you can't forget about growth while you're dealing with a crisis. And then you have to work internally to reprioritize your public finances to meet the most pressing need. That's what we had to do. So these 2 facilities were really helpful. And I hope, as we discuss mobilizing resources for humanitarian crisis, we can think about innovative ways to establish, financing instruments or facilities that will have the same type of flexibilities that are built in the 2 facilities I've talked to you about, with some safeguards. I just wanted to highlight that. The second thing is for all of us to appreciate and pay fuller attention to the political context on the ground. This is important. In our case, when Ebola came from one of our neighbors, and then because of Liberia's history of conflict, of mistrust, of exclusion, and all of the things that had to do with bad governance, people initially did not trust their own government, that indeed Ebola was for real, So that didn't help, all right? So the context on the ground made it difficult to respond initially in a very, very aggressive way. So it had to take the political leadership of the country to really say, wait a minute, we need to work together now beyond the boundaries of separation of power, where the legislature, the judiciary, the executive come together so that the country sees the 3 governments coming together. Because the idea of separation of powers really was check and balances. And people tend to thrive in that, to enhance their own mistrust in the government. But when they see the 2 of them, the 3 branches, in our case, dealing with the crisis, it was easier to get the superintendents, who are governors in some state in federal arrangements, the commissioners, the town chiefs, all the way down lining up. That was helpful. So that brought urgency to the matter. And then we look at our own limited resources and say, okay, how do we deal with this now? Because initially, you'll recall, international response was very slow, and I think this is one of the areas we need to talk about as we now go to this humanitarian summit and as we begin to predict, crisis in the future. Let us now wait until the crisis happens. We saw how the Central African Republic overnight was unable to pay its workers. We see now Burundi, for example, things are happening there. It's about time to get involved, before it gets out of control. But back to the MRU situation, you look internally, you prioritize your expenditure because your budget, your revenue is going to fall because it's a function of the economy. And so that's what we did. And we prioritized those institutions that were identified and best positioned to deal with the crisis until our partners came to our aid. And we did that, relatively well. And then to Bruce's question, the money came. When the money came in the country, how do you move it quickly? Became the challenge. And this is where the donors show their flags. And I think most of us are in this room can attest to that. Everybody wants their flag on CNN, on the big screen, etc., which is good. But the country leadership is important. So what we did, we brought everybody together. All of the money, the World Bank money that came in, the World Bank does not have the capacity on the ground to deliver the services that were needed to deal with this humanitarian crisis. So we brought in the UN family. We have a program in Liberia called Delivering as One. UNICEF, WHO, UNDP, UNOPS, everybody came to the table. Deliver as one. You don't really have the money, but you have the capacity to do it. We will use your procurement rules to bring, the PPEs, the stuff for the Ebola treatment units on the ground faster because you have your resources, you have your procurement rules that the World Bank and everybody believes in. So we were able to do that. And the result was we were able to increase the capacity to bring in more patients into the treatment centers. We were able to bring in quickly, in a matter of 48 hours, more equipment for our health workers. And then when it became an international issue for our international leaders, when President Obama jumped in, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, Jim came here, then the EU, the AU, the African Union, sent in health workers, etc. We were best positioned now to provide the resources for those health workers so that they didn't get infected. So just to share concrete examples of how we dealt with this, the key is to replicate flexible financing facilities with sufficient safeguards. That would be key. Number two, to recognize the political context, in the countries where the crisis is happening, mainly making sure that they own it, first, and then the donors can line up behind the government operation. And then three, to look beyond your flag, to be able to come to the table in good faith to say we're going to try to save lives versus making names for our institution. Thank you.
Thank you. Very well said, and you acknowledged, and you were very kind in citing some of our institutions that played a pivotal role. We also know there were some challenges as well in terms of the kind of flexibility, and we're trying to learn from those challenges. One specific example had to do with the payment for foreign medical workers, which, as you know, became a very challenging step for the World Bank to take because we could not finance them directly. We had to go through governments. And the government of Liberia, to its credit, was willing to follow that arrangement, but we had to do some negotiations with others, which took almost a year. But we are taking an important lesson from that experience, which is not only should we provide the money, but we should also make sure that the mechanisms for delivery are there and that we can work even with non-state actors in these situations of crises. You also mentioned the critical role of the United Nations. You mentioned the platform that was provided by the United Nations. And that allows me to turn very nicely to our last speaker, Izumi Nakamitsu, the Assistant Administrator and Director of Crisis Response at UNDP. She's traveled all the way here to be with us, and I would like to invite you to offer your reflections on what you have heard, what it means perhaps in terms of some of the principles we take forward as we work together in this space, one in which you have perhaps more experience than we do as a development institution, in trying to ensure that governments have their role to play, as the Honorable Minister just said, that we are focusing resources where they need to be focused, also in terms of prevention, but also ultimately that we have a robust system in place to know that these resources are being used well. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Colin. It's really great to be here. I spend a lot of time with you these days. I am also very happy how you framed this session. Of course, more money is important. There is a gap in financing. So we will, of course, make efforts to bring in more money so that the needs will be met. But at the same time, one of the key messages of the two recent reports, one is, of course, the Secretary General's report for World Humanitarian Summit, and the other one is a report prepared by Kristina Georgieva and her colleagues on the Secretary General's high-level panel for humanitarian financing. One of the key messages or themes from these two very important reports is that it's not sustainable to continue to try to just simply meet the humanitarian needs. We've got to try and work towards reducing the humanitarian needs themselves, which means that it is also about we need to do the business differently from the business model that we've had so far. So let me just focus on perhaps three sets of changes that we are trying to make in the context of the World Humanitarian Summit and beyond from the UN side. And I will say that these changes that we want to have will be a rather dramatic, profound changes which would affect both humanitarian organizations and also development organizations of the UN system, but also I think beyond. Our colleagues and partners from civil society actors, first responders at the country level, we will all be very much affected. So, number one, we've got to do the sort of needs assessment, joint analysis, joint planning framework. This has to actually be a very different model. At the moment, we all look at the situation, analyze the situation, and plan our activities and interventions from a silo, from a mandate-driven boxes. So we need to move from that paradigm towards working under one framework with a collective and agreed results and outcomes. In other words, we have to have more outcome-driven planning and analytics right. And then against that one framework, of course, the donor communities, the financing institutions, and private sectors can actually come around and then put more additional, of course, funding, which are more sustainable, more predictable on a multi-year basis. But we actually argue that these two issues, the financing and how we plan, how we analyze the needs and get the analytics right, are two sides of the same coin. They have to go together. The second is some panelists have already mentioned, but we've got to also tackle underlying causes. Some people call them root causes that drive the need for humanitarian responses. That would mean that we've got to invest more in preparation, prevention. That would mean a very concrete manner. We need to actually look at how the peaceful and inclusive societies can be made through preventative investment. We have to look at the human rights aspect. We have to look at resilient health system, a key issue which we learned from the Ebola crisis. We have to also look at how the governance structures can be strengthened. These are all very important investments for us to be able to actually tackle underlying causes that drive humanitarian needs. In other words, linking very directly to the Secretary General's message of reducing humanitarian needs themselves. The statistics actually are not very encouraging so far in this regard. Only about 0.5% of $3 trillion of aid between 1991 and 2010 was spent on prevention or preparedness. So this has to change. We've got to actually do much more investment in resilience building as we broadly frame those actions. Third, in the similar vein, we have to also invest and strengthen local capacities and systems of what we call the first responders. Of course, the international community, the humanitarian community, will always have a very important role to play in terms of responding to humanitarian crises. That would always be there. But at the same time, we have to look at the first responders at the community level, at the local level, both within the communities, but also local government and national governments, so that they will have better capacities and coping mechanisms to, in fact, tackle the crisis when they happen. So the investments will need to be made in those local responders, first responders, again, in order for us to be able to really, in a way, reduce the humanitarian needs themselves, invest in local capacities. This will bring me back to my first point, outcome-driven planning. We have to have the joint and analytics plannings to be done, not from a silo, but collectively between the humanitarian and development organizations. This will be a major change for humanitarian organizations because they will have to look at not just the phenomenon of humanitarian needs, but what is actually underneath them that are driving. But for us, development organizations, we also have to go through a major shift in our mentalities and the way we work as well. I'll give you very concrete examples. Everyone is now talking about protracted displacement situations. In a very sort of self-reflective manner, we, development organizations, do not actually ask the development questions related to displacement. And that has to change as well, and this will be our commitment. For example, we're not really asking the question automatically, so what's the impact of this major displacement on local economy, labor market, government's revenue, capacity of local institutions to deliver basic services? Those developmental questions will need to be asked. We have to ask ourselves, and we have to actually jointly analyze. That will require much better data sets. We need to have, the better sort of mechanisms to actually pool different sets of data and evidence for us to be able to plan together so that we'll be actually tackling the root causes and underlying causes that are making a big crisis unfold in front of us. We will also have to be able to measure progress. If we are talking about outcome-driven planning, then we've got to be able to measure the progress in the second year and third year of the multi-year planning. So that is also a big change that we have to go through within the development and humanitarian communities of the UN. This is why we want to work very closely with IFIs. When I talk about working closely with IFIs, we are not actually talking about additional money that we want to see, but we need to actually have the kinds of data that we don't actually look at in a very sophisticated manner currently. So we are very much looking forward to working together with those actors who have that kind of data and analytics for us to be able to have a new business model. This is something that we have actually started to work very, very intensely between the UN, humanitarian and development communities. We need to make sure that annual-based humanitarian planning cycle and multi-year UN development framework, ANDAF, or now it's increasingly be called as partnership framework. These two sets of different planning will need to be brought together and better harmonized. These things are actually beginning to happen. Very concrete examples, I'm sure you have discussed earlier at the Fragility Forum, for example, in the MENA region, but in many other places in Africa, we are beginning to look at how to integrate some of the humanitarian considerations into a multi-year development framework. And then we would like to make sure that this would actually become the norm rather than the exceptions. And that's our objective, one of the objectives at the Humanitarian Summit. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think let's put our hands together for all of our speakers, please. Not only because of the substance of what they had to say, but also the disciplined way in which they did it, allowing us to stick to our time. We started late, but we are set for on time and on time ending. You know, I am struck by how we have now come full circle. We began by talking about money, but we're ending by talking about reform. We're talking about ownership. We're talking about the quality of money, but also the quality of spending. We're talking about the quality of planning. We're talking about measuring results. And as Izumi and I work together in different fora on these topics, I have to let you know in all honesty that for some members of some participants in that conversation, this is a bit of a revolution. Imagine yourself coming from a situation where you're driven by a moral imperative, where you are focused on saving lives, where you have hundreds of thousands of people in the field who are delivering care and maintenance, who are risking and losing their lives. That's your business. And then you deal with people like some of us who are sitting in capitals or sitting in the financial centers and saying, oh, well, come to think of it, you need to do some more analysis about how you're going about saving lives, and it's not just about more money. Take, for example, the fact that 8 to 9% of what you're spending in terms of care and maintenance is for people who have been displaced for over 3 years. After 3 years, should people still be receiving care and maintenance, or should it be something else? All right? Talk about financial transparency, which is what we were talking about in Amsterdam earlier this week. Talk about accountability. These are almost foreign concepts. It's almost as if one is being rude and insensitive, given the noble work that some of our colleagues are doing. But nonetheless, this is a conversation we have to have. A respectful one that is inclusive, that recognizes that we need more money, we need more innovations around how we mobilize that money, we need more instruments, but we also need the kind of political sensitivity that the Honorable Minister spoke about. And we also need to have the rigor that Izumi spoke about. So I hope you will take these messages away with you, and that in your spheres of influence, you will help to spread them. And help others to understand that as we come at this from different angles, we're after the same thing. Still about saving lives, still about restoring dignity, still about eliminating extreme poverty, still about boosting prosperity, still about investing in humanity, in the words of the Secretary General. Thank you all very much for spending this time with us. Thank you.